It's contrary to everything that we stand for. We stand for providing refuge for those who want to escape their own awful circumstances and live in freedom and opportunity. It's my grandparents escaping Ukraine. It's my wife's grandparents leaving China. It's the Schatzes. It's the Binders. It's the Kwaks. It's Albert Einstein. It's Madeleine Albright. This is who we are. We are people from all over the world who are united not by our ethnic extraction or religious affiliation, but tied together by our love for America. And here's the thing, it's not even as though we are trading liberty for security. We are getting no additional security. This is all about being cruel to Muslims because it's good politics for some people. This isn't just morally wrong, it's also guaranteed not to work. This ban is just ridiculous as a homeland security measure. First, 0 people from the countries on the ban list have been involved in terrorist attacks in America. 0 people from the countries on the ban list have been involved in terrorist attacks on America. It's almost as though the criteria for picking the countries is something other than the threat of terrorism. Second, this ban has the potential to strengthen violent extremist groups by playing right into their hands. It encourages everyone to be afraid of people we don't know from other places. That's not America, and it won't work. When President Gerald Ford repealed the executive order interning Japanese Americans, he asked citizens across the country to make a pledge. He said, and I quote, "I call upon the American people to affirm with me this American promise, that we have learned from the tragedy of that long ago experience forever to treasure liberty and justice for each individual American, and resolve that this kind of action shall never again be repeated." That promise is being broken. It's broken for the American who came to this country as a lost boy from Sudan and who now can't see his family. It's broken for the American married to an Iranian who the government is splitting from her husband. And it's broken for the millions of Americans, the majority of us, who want us always to have the moral high ground. The world is watching. History is watching. And we have to ask ourselves, what do they see? Do they see Lady Liberty? Or do they see something darker? The choice is ours. We can fix this. And we start by following the wise words of Fred Korematsu, an outspoken voice against Japanese internment and an American hero whose birthday is today, 98 years old. He said, "Protest, but not with violence, and don't be afraid to speak up." Today, I call on every member of the United States Senate to follow Mr. Korematsu's advice. Speak up and stand against this ban and fight chaos and paranoia as official government policy. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask that we vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam President, the last 6 years have been devastating to local economies across the whole country. The Mine Safety and Health Administration has estimated that at least 60,000 coal jobs have been lost since 2011, and thousands of these jobs have been in my home state of West Virginia. Excessive government regulation and other factors have done more than cost jobs. These policies have imperiled our coal miner retirement benefits, and they have left local governments struggling to keep up, to pay for education, to pay for public works, and law enforcement. I mean, I can tell you story after story I've seen in our newspapers about this very thing. In October, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee heard testimony from Wayne County, West Virginia Commissioner Robert Paisley. He said that the coal severance tax revenues in West Virginia, Wayne counties in West Virginia, in his county had dropped by 88% between 2013 and 2016. This drop left the county without a vital funding source that traditionally helped to pay for local volunteer fire departments, senior citizens programs, and education. West Virginia University economist John Deskins told the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee in August that 6 West Virginia counties were suffering a depression because of the coal downturn. And just last week, the state of West Virginia projected its annual state budget faces a $500 million shortfall. So what was the response of President Obama's administration in the last days in power? Yet another job-killing and anti-coal regulation that would make a bad situation in my state worse. The Department of the Interior published its stream protection rule on December the 20th, 2016, and it made the rule effective January 19th, 2017, just one day before President Obama left office. There's a lot of irony here, and I don't think it's by chance. According to a national mining study, 1/3 of coal jobs could be placed, 1/3 of remaining coal jobs could be placed at risk by this rule. And today I'm proud to join Leader McConnell as he introduces the Stream Protection Congressional Review Act. We are also joined by my colleagues in the West Virginia congressional delegation, including Congressman David McKinley and Congressman Evan Jenkins and others. we are going to be introducing a resolution of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act, blocking the Obama administration's stream protection rule. Once this resolution of disapproval is passed by Congress, and I believe that it will be, and signed by President Trump, which I believe that it will be, something I am confident that this will both happen, the stream protection rule will be nullified, and the Department of Interior will be prohibited from proposing a similar rule without permission from this Congress. The stream protection rule deserves to be eliminated through the Congressional Review Act. Despite its title, you might say, why would you get rid of something called the stream protection rule? Despite its title, this rule will do little to actually protect our streams. But if left in place, this rule would cost even more coal jobs in my state and across the country that have already been devastated. West Virginia's Department of Environmental Protection Secretary Randy Huffman told the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on which I served this last Congress, that the proposed version of the stream protection rule was, quote, an unnecessary and uncalled for political gesture. I would like to say that Secretary Huffman was serving under a Democrat governor in my state. The stream protection rule is the result of an incredibly flawed regulatory process that excluded state officials. Of the 10 states that began the regulatory process, people were asked to join together to begin this process, working with the Department of Interior's Office of Surface Mining. 8 of those states eventually removed themselves from the process because of the department's unwillingness to actually seriously consider their input. In other words, they were just there for window dressing. Ohio Chief of Mineral Resources Management Larry Erdos told the Environment and Public Works Committee last February that, quote, OSM has not provided for meaningful participation with the cooperating or commenting agency states. Congress took action to instruct the Department of Interior to re-engage with the states, realizing what was happening here, before moving forward with this rulemaking process. However, despite this direction from lawmakers in the Congress, the department failed to address the state concerns. Wyoming Director of Environmental Quality, Todd Parfit, told the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, quote, the failure to engage cooperating agencies throughout the process is reflected in the poor quality of the proposed rule. He called on the Office of Surface Mining to withdraw the rule and re-engage with states and other stakeholders. Last week, West Virginia's newly appointed Secretary of Environmental Protection, again under a new Democrat governor, Austin Caperton, wrote to congressional leaders detailing our state's concerns with the stream protection rule. Secretary Caperton gave 3 main reasons for West Virginia's opposition to this rule. First, he said that the rule upsets the statutory balance between environmental protection and allowing coal mining to take place in the first place. Second, the rule conflicts with the congressionally directed role of the states to be the exclusive regulators of mining activities. And third, the rule conflicts with the Federal Clean Water Act and state water quality standards. Pretty broad-ranging concerns. The concerns from environmental regulators in mining states across the country explain why 14 states, including the state of West Virginia, have already filed lawsuits to stop the stream protection rule. 15 state attorney generals, led by West Virginia's Attorney General Patrick Morrisey, have written to Congress asking that this rule be blocked through this Congressional Review Act. State environmental regulators are not alone in their opposition to this rule. Cecil Roberts, who is the president of the United Mine Workers of America, wrote just last week in support of this resolution of disapproval. He said that, quote, the last thing America's coal-producing regions need at this time is another regulation that will have the effect of reducing employment even more and further stifling economic development, end quote. West Virginia cannot afford another job-killing regulation that once again inserts Washington, their one-size-fits-all standard, into a regulatory process that is supposed to be effectively managed and is effectively managed by our state agencies. The stream protection rule is a flawed policy that was born out of a flawed process. The rule deserves to be eliminated promptly, and I encourage my colleagues to co-sponsor the McConnell-Capito resolution of disapproval and to vote to block the rule in the coming days. On another matter, Madam President, the Environmental Protection Agency, which bears most of the blame for regulations targeting energy jobs, is in dire need of a change of direction. The EPA under the Obama administration was unwilling to engage the people of West Virginia in public listening sessions or hearings about decisions that directly impacted our state's economies, and I described what the result of that has been. This failure to effectively engage resulted in a number of job-killing regulations, like the utility MATS rule for power plants, the so-called Clean Power Plan, and the waters of the U.S. As you know, Madam President, the waters of the U.S. rule is something that impacts not just mining, agriculture, construction, and really has far-reaching implications. Scott Pruitt, who is President Trump's nominee to become the EPA administrator, has gone through a thorough review process by the Environment and Public Works Committee. At Attorney General Pruitt's confirmation hearing, senators from both parties were permitted to engage in as many as 4 rounds of questioning. Some of them were pretty tough. After the hearing, Attorney General Pruitt answered 1,078 questions for the record. Combining both the hearing and the follow-up questions, Attorney General Pruitt answered more than 1,200 questions from our committees. Through the process, Attorney General Pruitt has shown himself to be a person who cares about applying our environmental laws as they were written and intended by Congress. He has a strong record of enforcing environmental statutes in a balanced way and ensuring clean air and clean water without unnecessarily sacrificing jobs or economic growth. Attorney General Pruitt has been clear that he will work with state regulators and listen to the views of individuals who will be most heavily impacted by EPA's regulatory decisions. I believe that Attorney General Pruitt will keep his word and provide a refreshing change in direction for West Virginia coal miners, natural gas workers, manufacturers, and farmers, and indeed for all of our communities that are struggling with the effects of overregulation. I look forward to supporting Attorney General Pruitt. His nomination in the EPW committee will come before the committee on Wednesday morning, and I look forward to seeing him confirmed on the Senate floor soon. With that, Madam President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended,
Without objection.
and I ask unanimous consent to speak for 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Okay. The resolution of disapproval that I'm introducing today via the Congressional Review Act repeals a Social Security regulation that unfairly stigmatizes people with disabilities. It also violates the fundamental nature of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment recognizes the God-given right to self-defense. In order to take away that right, the government must have a compelling interest. Furthermore, the law or regulation to achieve that compelling interest must be narrowly tailored. In other words, the government better have one heck of a good reason for going against the Second Amendment. The Justice Department, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Social Security Administration have not protected Second Amendment rights adequately under the previous administration. Our fundamental Second Amendment rights were constantly under attack. For example, hundreds of thousands of veterans have been reported to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System without due process. And of course, that system amounts to a national gun ban list for those reported erroneously. Veterans were reported without first having a neutral authority find them in danger to self or others, and thus having a legitimate right to deny them their Second Amendment rights. According to the government, the veterans needed a fiduciary to manage benefit payments, and that is not a sufficient reason under the law. Needing help with your finances, simply needing that help, should not mean that you have surrendered your fundamental right of self-defense. And it doesn't mean that you're a danger to the public. On May 17, 2016, Senator Durbin and I debated my amendment that would require the Department of Veterans Affairs to first find veterans to be a danger before reporting their name to the gun ban list. During the course of that debate, Senator Durbin admitted that the list was broader than it should have been. Senator Durbin said, quote, "Let me just concede at the outset, reporting 174,000 names goes too far, but eliminating 174 names goes too far." Now, for the record, that's the end of Senator Durbin's quote. For the record, it was 260,381 names from the Veterans Administration that it sent the gun ban list for allegedly being in, quote, mental defective category. Now, it just happens that that was 98 0.8% of all the names in that category. So the Veterans Administration reported more names by far than any other agency. Senator Durbin's staff and mine have met over these issues since that debate. I appreciate and thank Senator Durbin for that outreach, and I want to work together with him to solve these problems for the VA. But now, the Social Security Administration is about to make the same mistake as the Veterans Administration. Now, that is, unless we stop them right here and right now with that resolution of disapproval. And if we don't stop this, it could lead to hundreds of thousands of Social Security recipients being improperly reported to the gun ban list. At its core, Social Security's new regulation allows the agency to report people to the gun ban list if, under two circumstances. First, the beneficiary needs to have someone designated to help manage benefit payments. Sounds like the VA, right? And two, the beneficiary has an affliction based on a broad, quote-unquote, disorders list. But the process for designating someone to help a recipient manage Social Security benefits is not a process that is very objective. But the process for designating someone to help a recipient manage their Social Security benefit should be objective. The former Social Security Administrator and Inspector General said the following last year in testimony about this process that offends us here in the Senate for the reason of this resolution. Quote, "It's not a scientific decision. It's more of a personal opinion," end of quote. The personal opinion of a bureaucrat, then, cannot be the basis for taking away a person's fundamental Second Amendment right to bear arms. Further, the second element, this so-called disorder list, is a convoluted mess of afflictions that may or may not cause someone to be considered dangerous. Many of the listed disorders also do not impact gun safety at all. For example, some afflictions deal with anxiety disorders, fear of large crowds, or a lack of self-esteem. The list is complex, the list is long, and the list is not designed to regulate firearms. Rather, the list is designed to regulate whether a person can manage his or her beneficiary payments. In other words, can they handle money? But here's the essential question that the federal government is incapable of answering. If they aren't dangerous, why does the Social Security Administration, like the VA, want to take away their guns? The National Council on Disability, a nonpartisan and independent federal agency, has come out against the Social Security Administration's rule and in favor of the repeal that this resolution of disapproval will accomplish. The Council has repeatedly stated its concerns about the agency failing to determine that people are dangerous before reporting their names to the gun ban list. It has been the Council on Disability's, quote, long-held position that restrictions on gun possession and ownership based on psychiatric or intellectual disability must be based on a verifiable concern as to whether the individual poses a heightened risk of danger to themselves or others, end of quote. The Council has also stated that the rule, quote, unnecessarily and unreasonably deprives individuals with disabilities of a constitutional right. It increases the stigma for those who, due to their disability, may need a representative payee, end of quote. Another organization, the Consortium for Individuals with Disabilities, and that's a coalition of 100 national disability groups, shares the same concern about the regulation that we're having this resolution of disapproval about. Quote, the current public dialogue is replete with inaccurate stereotyping of people with mental disabilities as violent and dangerous, and there is a real concern that the kind of policy change encompassed by this rule will reinforce those unfounded assumptions, end of quote. With that being said, even the ACLU wrote a letter in opposition to the agency's regulations, and Madam President, I'd like to enter these letters in the record, as well as other letters from disability groups at the end of my statement.
Without objection.
Simply stated, the agency rule uses a massive regulatory net that captures innocent individuals who should be left alone. Just because a person is assigned a fiduciary does not make that person or those persons dangerous. Whenever the government tries to eliminate fundamental constitutional rights, it is required to narrowly tailor its regulatory actions so that innocent people are not impacted. The Social Security regulation fails in that regard. That is why both the National Council on Disability and the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities have called specifically for using this Congressional Review Act to repeal the final rule. And that's what our introduction of a resolution will accomplish. Constitutional due process is wholly lacking. For example, the agency does not afford a beneficiary a formal hearing before his or her name is reported to the gun ban list. Now think about that. The Second Amendment, which recognizes a fundamental constitutional right, is being simply ripped away without a formal dispute process to initially challenge the action. Instead, the beneficiary must wait until their name is already on the gun ban list, and only then can the beneficiary appeal the decision by grace of the government. Now, this process effectively reverses what should be a burden on the government. The government should not be able to strip a fundamental constitutional right without due process and then place the burden on the citizen to try to restore it. A hearing should be afforded before the infringement of a fundamental right, not afterwards. And the burden must be on the government to prove its case. Now, that simply is the American way, our Constitution's way. The Social Security Administration regulation falsely claims that it requires an adjudication before reporting names to the gun ban list. But there is no hearing afforded to the Social Security recipient before placing a name on the gun ban list. And of course, without a hearing, that process cannot honestly be called an adjudication. In other words, the Social Security Administration is blowing blue smoke when they say that. And without an adjudication, the process violates federal law. Now, here's the kicker. In order for beneficiaries to remove their names from the gun ban list, they have to prove that they are not dangerous. So, guilty until proven innocent. And the burden is on you to prove your innocence. Any way you look at it, that is totally unfair, violation of the Constitution, but common sense ought to tell everybody it's just plain wrong. The federal government, under the Obama administration, treated Social Security recipients with contempt and disregard when this rule was put out. So with our resolution of disapproval, we can effectively terminate this unconstitutional government regulation which the new Trump administration supports. I encourage all of my colleagues to support our efforts. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, shortly we are going to be taking up the motion to proceed with the cloture motion in regards to the confirmation process of Mr. Tillerson to be the Secretary of State for our country. I had the opportunity as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to meet with Mr. Tillerson, have a chance to talk with him concerning his vision for America, participated in a lengthy committee hearing where not only I had a chance to ask him questions, but every member of the committee had a chance to ask questions, and then had the opportunity to present questions for the record and look at his responses to questions for the record. And I would say on the outset of this debate on the floor of the United States Senate that Mr. Tillerson is a successful business person. I am certain that he has great negotiating skills, as he's shown as the CEO of ExxonMobil. And I think that's an important ability to have if he were confirmed as Secretary of State. I do think he wants to serve our nation, and he has put forward his ability to serve as Secretary of State for the right reasons. However, I have serious reservations as a result of this process, this confirmation process, that leads me to the conclusion that I cannot support his nomination, and I will be voting against his nomination. And I wanted to at least start this debate by giving some of the reasons why I will not be supporting Mr. Tillerson to be the Secretary of State. Mr. Tillerson's business orientation and his lack of moral clarity to questions that were asked during the confirmation hearing, to me, it compromises his ability to forcefully promote the values and ideals that defined America's leading role in the world for more than 200 years. And when I'm referring to the values of good governance, the values of standing up for human rights, the values of speaking up for a free press, the values of recognizing the importance of civil societies, which is lacking in so many places around the world. So when Mr. Tillerson was asked the question as to how he would characterize what Russia is doing in Syria in supporting a regime that has attacked humanitarian convoys, whether that should be considered as war crimes, Mr. Tillerson was less than clear as to how he would characterize Russia's conduct in Syria. When I asked Mr. Tillerson how he would characterize Philippines President Duterte's extrajudicial killings, this is a president that has authorized individuals to be killed on sight without judicial process, which has been well documented, whether that was a gross violation of human rights, Mr. Tillerson was less than clear as to whether that, in fact, would elevate to a serious human rights violation. And when I asked the question whether under any circumstances we could have a national registry for any group of religious or ethnic minorities in America, his answer was not as clear as I would have hoped it to be. The answer should have been a simple no, but he did not give that answer in that moral clarity. So for all those reasons, I have serious concern as to whether he will speak with strong voice on American values or whether that'll be compromised for narrow business interests or for other considerations that should not take priority to the values that have made America the great nation it is. And Madam President, I was concerned about this before what's happened in recent days. But when I take a look at President Trump's first 10 days in office, and I look at the executive orders that he has issued as President of the United States, it's even more critical that the next Secretary of State speak with moral clarity as to the values of America. The gag order that was reimposed by President Trump, it wasn't the same gag order that other administrations have imposed. It is far broader and could prevent U.S. participation with health workers around the world to stop the spread of HIV/AIDS or to deal with the Zika virus or to deal with issues concerning global health issues, maternal health. That I want someone as Secretary of State to say that America stands for providing the leadership that we need on global health issues. Or more recently, when President Trump announced his Mexican policy, that it would build a wall, not only ask the taxpayers to pay for it once, but to pay for it twice, to build the wall, which almost anyone will tell you won't work. We do have tunnels that we already know could go under walls. It'll be expensive. But he's also asking Americans to pay for it twice because he's going to impose a tariff, at least that's under consideration, that middle-income families will end up paying, starting a trade war with Mexico. And why? Why would you start this? Mexico is working with us to stop illegal immigration. They're working with us to stop the illegal trafficking of drugs. They're working with us to build a regional economy that benefits both countries. Why would we pick a fight with our neighbor? It makes no sense whatsoever. But, Madam President, the last thing that was done over this weekend points out even more clearly why we need a Secretary of State who will speak with moral clarity. And that was this outrageous, reckless, and dangerous executive order that would ban certain individuals from coming to America. It would put a hold on our refugee program and would establish a religious test for people coming to America, a Muslim ban. That's not what America stands for. I believe that executive order is illegal. I know that that executive order will put Americans at risk. I would like to know from our Secretary of State how he, if he is confirmed, would respond when other countries say, why should we help you when you won't allow Muslim countries the right to visit your country? Why should we give you that information? How will Americans who are traveling abroad be treated? It puts all of it at risk, and our next Secretary of State has to have that credibility to deal with other countries with moral clarity. Time and time again, when confronted with questions, Mr. Tillerson was not clear. And let me just give you one example that I think may sum up my concern on his moral clarity issues, and that's with Russia. We had asked several times whether he would support the existing sanctions, whether he would support stronger sanctions. After all, the sanctions were put on because Russia invaded Ukraine. They're still there. They're still in Crimea. They're still interfering with eastern Ukraine. And unless they comply with the Minsk agreement, our European allies are looking for America to say, no way would we ever weaken our sanctions as long as Russia's violating its commitment in Ukraine. But since that, they've done other things. I already mentioned the war crimes that they're committing in Syria, but they also attacked America. They attacked us through cyber, trying to bring down our democratic system of government, free elections. I would have certainly have hoped that Mr. Tillerson would have shown some compassion for increasing sanctions against Russia. But instead, we asked him a question about Cuba. And Mr. Tillerson was very clear when he's talked about Cuba. He said, look, if we do business with Cuba, we're allowing a repressive regime to have greater resources. Why would we want to support a regressive regime? But Mr. Tillerson didn't show the same concern about Russia. He has no compulsion at all about doing business with Russia, even though that business is allowing the Putin repressive regime to carry out their activities of attacks against our allies, attacks against us, interfere in what's going on in Syria, and to do all the other activities that they're doing. I would have hoped that we would have seen a greater sense of moral clarity from our Secretary of State nominee. Madam President, there are other issues that I am concerned about, and I know tomorrow we'll have a chance to talk about it if this issue is still on the floor tomorrow, as I expect it will be. We'll have a chance to talk about issues about his, I think, quick use of military power versus diplomacy. We asked him several times about external events and how he would respond to that. His answer was too quick about using our military and not quick enough about using our diplomacy. The use of military must be a matter of last resort, and I want to make sure that our next Secretary of State is very sensitive to that particular issue. And then we get to the concern about the ethical issues. And I need to mention this because when we asked him questions about his knowledge of ExxonMobil, he was less than forthcoming to the committee, not aware of ExxonMobil's lobbying on certain issues, very unclear about how its activities were in Sudan, Syria, Iran, and other countries that have horrible human rights records, and his willingness to recuse himself from anything affecting Exxon for 1 year, not for the entire length of term that he would be Secretary of State if confirmed by the Senate. He should not deal with ExxonMobil for the entire length of his time as Secretary of State. As a person who has substantial wealth as a result of his working at ExxonMobil, none of us criticize him on that, but it disqualifies him from dealing with ExxonMobil. So, Madam President, we're going to be involved in a lengthy debate on the next Secretary of State, as we should. But I just wanted to share with my colleagues my concern about Mr. Tillerson and why I'm opposing his nomination, and just indicate that I think the events, particularly over the weekend with this immigration policy, really points out the need for the next Secretary of State to be willing to stand strong for American values. And I have serious questions in that regard on Mr. Tillerson. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I am pleased to rise in support of the confirmation of Rex Tillerson to serve as our next Secretary of State. The proceedings in the Foreign Relations Committee for his nomination were fair, exhaustive, and in the best traditions of our committee and the Senate. Mr. Tillerson completed all of his required paperwork expeditiously, having met or exceeded the pace set by former Secretary Hillary Clinton after she was nominated in 2008. He testified at a public hearing for more than 8 hours and afterwards responded to over 1,000 additional questions for the record for committee members. Opinions and votes today on Mr. Tillerson may differ, but there is no question that the committee and the Senate has fulfilled its constitutional responsibility in carefully reviewing his nomination. As we proceed in ensuring the new administration has leaders it needs to implement our nation's foreign policy going forward, I have great confidence that Rex Tillerson will serve the United States well. In both my private meetings with him and in the hours of public testimony he offered before the Foreign Relations Committee, it has become clear that he will be an effective leader at the State Department. Mr. Tillerson has led an exemplary and honorable life. He has been at the same company for over 40 years. An Eagle Scout, he has served as National President of the Boy Scouts of America. Furthermore, the nonpartisan Director of Office of Government Ethics recently stated that Mr. Tillerson is making a clean break from Exxon and has even gone so far to say that Tillerson's ethics agreement serves as a sterling model for what we'd like to see with other nominees. Having managed one of the world's largest companies by revenue with over 75,000 employees, there is no doubt in my mind that Rex Tillerson is well qualified to lead the State Department. I encourage all of my colleagues to support his confirmation and look forward to his service as our next Secretary of State. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, President Trump issued an executive order banning Muslims from 7 countries. None of those countries was a source of terrorists who have carried out attacks in this country. That order was un-American. It was arbitrary. It's inhumane. And actually, it will likely spur an increase in violence targeting Americans. I'm going to have a lot more to say about it, and what I see as other reckless actions by the White House in the days and weeks ahead. In the meantime, let me just say a few words about the bizarre back and forth between the Trump administration and the news media regarding attendance at the inauguration, who's telling the truth, who's not. One might think that with all this happening in the country and the world, and the rush by the president to sign executive orders that would dramatically affect the rights and the priorities of millions of Americans, that the question of how many people were at the inauguration wouldn't generate much controversy. But it turns out this is much more than that. As it goes to the heart, the role of a free press in this country, and whether the American people can have confidence the president's telling the truth. Now, we already knew the candidate, now President Trump, is prone to bragging and making wildly unrealistic promises and inaccurate claims, many of which he later disavows. He frequently ignores or misstates basic facts, then refuses to correct these falsehoods. So it's no surprise when he predicted the crowd at his inauguration would be an unbelievable, perhaps record-setting turnout. It was also no surprise, as usually happens at inaugurations of Republicans and Democrats or large public demonstrations, that you have high-elevation photographs, and those are used to estimate the number of participants. You can actually look at the photographs and count the number of people. Now, I've attended every inauguration since President Carter's inauguration. And certainly anyone who attended both the Obama and Trump inaugurations, it was obvious that the number of people at President Obama's inauguration was far larger than President Trump's inauguration. The photographs show that very, very clearly. It should be just a non-issue. But then President Trump insisted the photographs were fabricated. The morning after the inauguration, he could see from the stage in the west front of the Capitol that there were 1 million or 1.5 million people in the mall. I was standing 10 feet from him. I saw no such thing. And when reports clearly showed only a fraction of that, he accused news organizations of lying. He called them, quote, among the most dishonest human beings on earth. On earth. And he warned they'd regret it. Later that day, the president's spokesman, Sean Spicer, accused the press of lying. He said the photographs were deceptive. The photographs were taken the same way they're always taken, either Republican or Democratic inaugurals. He insisted President Trump's inauguration was the most watched ever, which of course was a clever distortion of what the president actually said. The president, of course, was talking about those present in the mall. I don't think people really care, but unfortunately, he does. A day later, Mr. Spicer berated the press for being unfair in reporting on this. Perhaps he had forgotten it was President Trump who initiated the whole thing by publicly promising something that did not happen, and the press simply reported what he said. Then he falsely accused the press of lying, as did Mr. Spicer after he's proven wrong. Mr. Spicer may have forgotten that shortly after President Obama was inaugurated, the Senate Majority Leader announced that the Republicans' #1 priority was to prevent him from being elected to a second term. Failing that, they spent 8 years trying to obstruct, sabotage, discredit everything President Obama tried to do. In fact, during much of that time, Donald Trump carried on an utterly false campaign saying that President Obama was not a legitimate president because he lied about his birthplace, showing remarkable prescience on the part of Barack Obama that he was able to get a birth announcement in a Hawaiian newspaper one day after he was born. 2 days later, and without citing any evidence, because there is none, President Trump resurrected his false claim that he lost the popular vote because 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants voted. Of course, that's patently false and absurd. But one can assume they'll be repeated by those who want to justify more onerous, discriminatory voter suppression, voting requirements, which has been a crusade of theirs. Then to add insult to injury, Kellyanne Conway, the president's counselor, announced that President Trump, after all, will not release his tax returns. This after candidate Trump promised to do so once the routine audit is completed. She is, after all, the person who came up with the phrase alternative facts. Now, said nobody cares. Well, people have to file tax returns do care. They want to know whether the president has conflicts of interest, whether he's been telling the truth about what he owes, or whether he's enriching himself at our expense. Actually, they took a poll and they found between 60 and 74% of American people want President Trump to release his tax returns, Democrats and Republicans, including 49% of his own supporters. Well, we heard the response to that. Stephen Bannon said the media should keep its mouth shut. Calls the media the opposition party that does not understand this country. This in the nation has the greatest freedom of press of any country. Maybe they like what they do in Russia, where their friend Putin suppresses the press. So he's denigrated the press, attacked Muslims, attacked the CIA, attacked Mexico, attacked Meryl Streep, attacked the cast of Hamilton, attacked Congressman John Lewis, attacked undocumented migrants, or anybody thinks of at the moment. I take that back. There's one glaring exception. One of the worst gangsters in this world, Vladimir Putin, is praised and not attacked. Despite credible evidence that the Russian government and Putin's direction actively sought to sway the outcome of the election in favor of Donald Trump, now President Trump has repeatedly expressed admiration for Mr. Putin. Think what this means. The unanimous conclusion of U.S. intelligence agencies is that Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent, ordered a cyber attack on our electoral system in favor of one candidate over another. Russia's goals, as our own intelligence agents said, were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, harm her electability and potential presidency. Now, what would be the response? My friends in the Republican Party, the tables were turned. If a man like Putin had done this to their party, they would threaten to shut down the government until we had a new election. Certainly ask for an independent commission, as many of us have, to find out what they did. It's what Senator Durbin and I have called for. President Trump simply continues to praise Vladimir Putin. This should concern us all because for years Vladimir Putin has engaged in a systematic campaign to weaken the alliances, to weaken NATO. A man who's become one of the wealthiest people in the world for money he's stolen. So I see my distinguished colleague, the senior senator from California, and so I would ask consent to put my full statement on the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I simply ask we go back as parties to work together. I intend to vote for a number of President Trump's nominees. I'll vote against others. But stop the alternative facts. Facts should be facts.
Speak.
Is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Tillerson nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of State, Rex W. Tillerson of Texas to be Secretary.
Under the previous order, there will now be 30 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President.
The Senator from California.
Mr. President, how much time do I have?
The time has not been specifically apportioned to the Senator from California.
Well, thank you. I will try to confine it because I know there are others. I have come to the floor. We have just filed a resolution, a bill actually, with 26 co-sponsors that would repeal the immigration ban placed by President Trump. Mr. President, President Trump's Muslim ban is unnecessary, it's unconstitutional, and it's un-American, and it should be repealed immediately. The executive order prohibits individuals from Iran, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, and Yemen from entering the country. It even bars relatives of Americans from visiting. The order suspends the entire U.S. refugee program, and most egregiously, Syrian refugees are banned indefinitely, unless they're Christian. These provisions aren't what America is all about, Mr. President. First, the order is unnecessary. Individuals from the 7 targeted countries and 150 other nations are already thoroughly screened. Visitors fill out visa applications. They submit photographs that run through biometric databases. Their personal information is reviewed, including names, addresses, and dates of birth. They're interviewed at a United States consulate. The process can take months to complete and eliminates the need for the travel ban. In addition, the move to ban refugees has no legitimate national security reason, because these refugees undergo an even more thorough screening process that can take up to 2 years to complete. The vast majority of refugees are women and children who have experienced the absolute worst of humanity. Let us not forget the heart-wrenching image of the small body of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian boy washed up on a beach, dead. I will never forget this small boy in his short pants, his shoes, and his socks lying on that beach. To turn away women and children and men in their time of dire need is not what this nation is all about. Let me make this point. The poor execution of this executive order has resulted in chaos and confusion. It is unclear whether the Justice Department or Homeland Security had any input. There seems to have been a disagreement about whether it would apply to green card holders. There was confusion about whether it applies to individuals already in transit or approved for travel. And even airport directors, and I have spoken directly with the director of Los Angeles International, San Francisco International, there was confusion about how it applies, and even airport directors were left in the dark about how many people were detained and who they were. Sarah Yohani was one Californian caught up in this mess. She's an Iranian national studying at the California Institute for Human Science in San Diego under a valid student visa and being detained at LAX for 23 hours. She was sent back to Europe. a clear violation of the nationwide stay against the order. What I'm saying is that the court stay was actually violated. This is just one of more than 100 stories from the weekend. I believe this order is also unconstitutional. The First Amendment prohibits government from establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise of thereof. The order violates this First Amendment by targeting Muslims and favoring Christians. The order may also violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which forbids the government from burdening a person's exercise of religion. The law bars any discrimination based on national origin in the issuance of a visa. And finally, detaining people at airports may violate their Fourth Amendment rights. This was an ill-considered overreach, as the court showed over the weekend, and it should be repealed. So the bill that 27 of us are introducing rescinds the president's executive order. The text is simple because the message is simple. We won't stand for these types of actions. In a conclusion, I'd like to say I'm so proud of the peaceful demonstrations we saw, and I join those who are so passionate about the free exercise of religion and free speech. These are our values, Mr. President, as a nation, and I'll be right there with you if anyone tries to violate them. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Democrat leaders recognize.
Ask unanimous consent for 5 minutes for myself and then 5 minutes for the senator from Arkansas to answer and object to my objections after I make motions.
Is there objection? Without objection.
So, Mr. President, I will speak and then make my 2 motions, and then the senator from Arkansas can speak and either object or not, whatever he decides. Okay. Okay, Mr. President, I spoke at length on the President's executive order earlier. I just want to repeat. This executive order has made us less safe, less secure, put our troops in the field at increased risk, and was implemented in a way that caused chaos and confusion across the country. Most fundamentally of all, it is un-American. It flies in the face of a grand American tradition of granting refuge to those fleeing persecution, regardless of their race, religion, or political views. It is dangerous, it is shameful, it is wrong, it must be reversed immediately. And I know that many of my colleagues agree with me. They know that this is wrong. A dozen Republican senators and counting, including my good friend, the senior senator from Arizona, have expressed serious concern. One former Republican CIA director said, "It makes us less safe than we were Friday." So let's repeal the order and then sit down and discuss a smart, thoughtful, effective way to counter terrorism. President Obama wanted tougher vetting. Democrats are happy to look at proposals to that effect. But not this ineffective, un-American policy that will do more to empower our enemies and inspire those around the globe who would do us harm. Now, I'm going to make a second unanimous consent request, and I'll do them seriatim as the UC allowed. The second request is that we delay the confirmation vote on Secretary of State Rex Tillerson until these executive orders are overturned and he commits to opposing them. So far, this is the most important foreign policy order of the new administration. And in the committee hearing for his nomination, Mr. Tillerson appeared, he wasn't 100% certain, to roundly reject the idea of a blanket travel ban, just like the one President Trump signed. He said, quote, "I don't support a blanket travel ban on people coming to this country." He stressed in his opening statement that moderate Muslims are going to be our greatest allies in the fight against Islamic extremists. The implication was that he wouldn't support a proposal that would in any way alienate and inflame them. He said he didn't think it was helpful to suggest that Americans should be afraid of Muslims. That would suggest he might be wary about a policy that explicitly singles out 7 majority Muslim countries for different treatment under U.S. policy. Now, many of these comments, Mr. President, that he made to the committee, Mr. Tillerson did, are at odds with the president's policy. So, Mr. President, Democrats and Republicans alike and the American people, most of all, deserve to know whether Mr. Tillerson would implement this executive order or not, because it seems to directly contradict comments he made under oath to a Senate committee. Key allies in the world are wondering whether the potential future Secretary of State supports this policy, and so are the American people. And here are some important questions. Did he have any involvement or consultation in the construction and drafting of the executive order? How would he answer the outcries from countries around the world asking President Trump to rethink this policy? Does he think it would make us less safe? Does he think it would alienate Muslim communities around the world? And does he believe that current green card holders should be subject to another round of scrutiny if they come back to the U.S., even though they've been vetted before? We need these answers from President Trump's nominees. And Mr. Tillerson's nomination is before the Senate right now, so it's imperative we know what he thinks before moving forward. So, Mr. President, I am making two unanimous consent requests. First, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senator Feinstein's bill, Senate Resolution 240, introduced earlier today, that there be 2 hours of debate equally divided, and that upon the use or yielding back of time, the bill be considered read a third time and the Senate proceed to vote on the passage of the bill. Finally, there be no amendments, motions, or points of order to the bill.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Arkansas.
Does the Senator reserve the right to object?
I reserve the right to object if the Democratic leader wants to proceed with this.
Thank you.
The Democrat leader.
Second resolution. I ask unanimous consent that the cloture vote on calendar number 2, the nomination of Rex W. Tillerson for Secretary of State, be postponed until Executive Order 137 is rescinded and Mr. Tillerson has provided in writing to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee information pertaining to his involvement in the development of the executive order, as well as a statement declaring whether or not he agrees with the order.
Is there objection to the senator from New York's first request?
Mr. President, I object to the first request.
Objection is heard. Is there a objection to the second request of the Democrat leader?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Arkansas is recognized.
So, once again, we're hearing the Democrats and the media traffic in fake news. We've heard a lot on this floor and over the weekend about a Muslim ban. This is a so-called Muslim ban that applies to only 7 countries, and it does not apply to Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Nigeria, the 5 largest Muslim populations in the world. I've heard lots of claims on TV about 134 Muslims who could be affected. Of course, that leaves 1.6 billion Muslims who are not affected. This is not a Muslim ban. This is a temporary pause of movement from 7 countries, which President Trump did not pick from thin air. He picked from acts of this Congress and the Obama Department of Homeland Security. 5 countries in a state of near anarchy. A 6th country, Iraq, which has had a large part of its territory overrun by the Islamic State, and a 7th, Iran, which is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. Moreover, it's not a ban. It is simply a temporary pause for 3 to 4 months to evaluate whether Obama administration policies are strong enough to keep this country safe. We've also heard claims that this is somehow unconstitutional. However, there is no free-floating global right of people around the world to come to this country. President Trump's order is nothing more than a temporary pause on migration from countries with very weak state institutions or which sponsor terrorism, while the President and the administration take a more thorough review of our vetting procedures and the refugee program as a whole. Secretary Kelly has stated that it does not apply to green card holders. Secretary Mattis is reportedly advising that the long-term policy accommodate Iraqis with a documented history of serving with our troops, which I obviously support. In fact, a temporary pause for security evaluations is so sensible that in November 2015, after the Paris terrorist attacks, even the minority leader suggested, quote, a pause may be necessary, end quote. It wasn't beyond the pale then, and it's not now. Moreover, the people who are enforcing our laws on the front lines agree with President Trump. The Union for the Border Patrol and the Customs Enforcement agents have stated that they support this order and 2 other related immigration orders. Yet here's the minority shedding crocodile tears over President Trump's immigration and refugee policy. But where were those tears for the last 8 years when President Obama's foreign policy created all of these refugees? Where were the tears when President Obama overthrew the government of Libya with nothing to follow? Where were the tears when President Obama withdrew from Iraq, leaving that country to fend off Iran and the Islamic State? Where were the tears when President Obama gave Iran $100 billion to continue its imperial campaign throughout the Middle East, to include overthrowing the government of Yemen through its proxies? And most notoriously, where were the tears when President Obama stood idly by and watched Syria go up in flames? Spare me the tears now. If the minority is worried about the President's counsel and wants to make a difference in the real world, I suggest we get to work and we confirm Rex Tillerson to be the Secretary of State and Jeff Sessions to be the Attorney General. In the meantime, I object, and I yield the floor.
Objection is heard.
We're done.
I know it's Monday. I don't want to.
Is there further debate?
If not.
If not, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Rex Tillerson to be Secretary of State, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Rex W. Tillerson of Texas to be Secretary of State shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran.
Aye.
Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cochran, Cotton, Crapo, Ernst, Isaacson, Kennedy, McCain, Moran, Perdue, Roberts, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Cardin, Durbin, Feinstein, Reed, Schatz, Schumer, and Stabenow. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Udall, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Alexander, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. No. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. No. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth. No. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. No. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. No. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly. No. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. No. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Corker, Mr. Corker, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, no. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Franken, Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Nelson, Mr. Nelson, no. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Enzi, Mr. Enzi, aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Harris, Ms. Harris, no. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey? No. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren? No. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy? Aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Mnuchin. Mr. Mnuchin? Aye. Cruz. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines? Aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan? Aye.
Sergeant of Arms will restore order in the Senate. The galleries will remain quiet. The Sergeant of Arms will restore order.
all senators voted. Any senator wish to change their vote?
On this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 43, and the motion to invoke cloture is agreed to.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.